I get bored of just doing dig-a-good, right? And I acknowledge that boredom, and I think that boredom is important. In fact, I think all creativity, all real creativity arises from boredom. I'm Dan Tepfer, and this is Living the Creative Life.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining me here for this conversation. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Did you come from a musical or otherwise brainy family? You did mention that, was it astrophysics, the degree?
It's surprising how many musicians, especially jazz musicians, have degrees in science of some kind or another. Herbie Hancock has a bachelor's in electrical engineering. Jean-Michel Pilk, who's another jazz pianist, is a French jazz pianist, has a very advanced degree in math. Actually, it's a long list. There are many jazz musicians who surprisingly have degrees in science. So there must be some link there. As a jazz musician, you're constantly basically a real-time composer, and so you have to understand how things work. And there must be some kind of link between the minds of people who want to understand things, how things work, and become scientists, and people who want to understand how music works and become improvisers.
Did you ever feel like you had to make a choice between the classical tradition or the jazz one? It seems like you do both.
I did the whole conservatory system in Paris and played a ton of Bach and Rachmaninoff and all this stuff. And I loved playing it. But that was like, okay, I'm studying. But what I do I just identified for whatever reason very early on as a quote unquote artist, of 9 years old or whatever, what I do is improvise. So in other words, I did make that choice at a certain level of I'm a jazz person, but I never stopped loving the playing written music by great masters. I also never stopped loving writing computer programs. And so I just always have loved doing a lot of different things at once. But I also, at a pretty young age, I would say in my early 20s, I realized I really don't want to be a dilettante. And how can I avoid being a dilettante? I must choose one thing that I really need at a kind of a identity level to be competent at. And so that's jazz. But here I am in my early 20s, obsessed with the Goldberg variations. And so what do? Well, I'm practicing jazz every day. I'm really, doing that all the time. But I allow myself, an hour a day or whatever to learn the Goldberg variations. And then without any planning on my behalf, 10 years later, that becomes Goldberg Variations, this record where I play the 30 Goldberg Variations and then improvise after each one. And that really just arose entirely because I was following my nose about something that I love to do that was not part of my choice. Not part of I am an improviser, I'm a jazz musician, right? And it's totally the same with Natural Machines, which is this algorithmic music project that I put out in 2019. That also, I started programming when I was 9 or 10 years old. And in my late 20s, I started getting interested in programming music stuff. And I literally did that while procrastinating from writing a commission for Lee Konitz and Nanette. It was absolutely not part of any kind of choice. It was just something that I loved and that I was obsessed with. And then 10 years later, or 7 years later, that becomes this project, Natural Machines, which has also been, I think, a really successful endeavor for me. And again, it's really not planned in any kind of real way.
So let's talk about the creative impulse, the creative process of improvisation. When you sit down to the piano and you say, I'm going to improvise, what does that look like? What does that sound like?
Certainly how it's taught at this point in jazz programs. You will take as your frame within which you improvise a jazz standard. So let's say it could be, all the things you are. That's the first part of All the Things You Are. Beautiful song that I played hundreds of times with Lee Konitz, who is one of the great masters of jazz I was lucky to tour with for 12 years. But so you will take this as your frame, and you'll play the melody with its accompanying harmony, which is what I was just doing. And then once you've done that, that becomes one of the bookends of the improvisation. And then what happens is the harmonic structure of that melody keeps cycling, and you invent new ideas on top. So the harmonic structure becomes the frame for improvisation. It might sound like, you know, if you really accept this frame, the sky's the limit in terms of what you could do with that. You know, like say I could do it in 7/4, for example, and instead of inventing new melodies, maybe what I'm going to look for is something textural, you know, that involves more like chordal elements. So it could be like, you know, so that's, again, exactly the same frame, but with completely different ideas inside of it. Another way that I like to think about this that actually is a lot truer to my own experience is in terms of a parent and a child. Right? So in me, or in any creative person, I think at all times there is a child. Like, I like to imagine the child as maybe like a 4-year-old, like full of wild ideas, completely uninhibited, full of energy, loves to run around, gets really excited about all kinds of things, but also with no ideas about the dangers that exist in the world. So then there's also a parent supervising the child who allows the child all these flights of fancy and all these crazy things. But if they're coming close to a cliff, they'll just kind of gently steer them away from the cliff. And I think both are really equally important. So to look at this even a third way, my project, the algorithmic music project that I was just talking about, called Natural Machines. So I wrote computer algorithms that improvise with me in real time. Why is it called Natural Machines? It's because I'm fascinated, again, by this encounter between what you might call the natural on one side. Okay, so those are forces like intuition, emotion, mystery, poetry, right? And on the other hand, the mechanical. So forces like rational ideas about how to construct music, theory, algorithms, which are just hard and fast rules that are applied diligently. And there's no better example of this than Bach, who I would say a solid 50% of his music is algorithmic. It's because it's being determined to an extent by the rules of counterpoint, by the rules of fugue, for example, depending on what he's choosing to do, rules of canon. There are always these rule-based things. And then inside of that, he's smart enough to leave himself sufficient degrees of freedom that the natural, the poetic, the emotional, the mysterious can express itself. And so that's, again, a third way of looking at this encounter between the frame and what's inside the frame. And so to come back to your initial question about improvisation, for me, it all depends what it is that I'm trying to do. One of the things that I is important for me at a basic level of competence as a jazz pianist is to be able to improvise over a jazz standard, right? So I might say, I'm going to play over all the things you are in 5/8, and I'm going to do it in a different key. And also, I'm only going to use like a 3-note motive, you know? So I don't know, maybe the motive could be like, well, you want to sing something?
Ya-da-dum.
Ya-da-da, like just a triad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Kind of like the opening of Misty, for example.
Oh,
Yeah.
so not a triad, so.
Yeah.
So actually a triad, but in second inversion.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So and in 5/8, it might be like 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 4 5 right?
Yeah.
So it could be like. Right? And so that might be one really strict idea about improvisation. Feels really strict, but in fact, if I kept going with that, you could already see how it was kind of opening up because, I get bored of just doing digga, right? Get bored of that. So, and I acknowledge that boredom, and I think that boredom is important. In fact, I think all real creativity arises from boredom. It's a strong belief of mine. But so I acknowledge that boredom and I say, I want to do something different now, right? But then I might still return to that, right? So let me continue maybe. So I'm the B section of all the things you are. So. Right? Now it feels good for it to come back, right? Because I went away from it a little bit. Now it's like, that's like, it's satisfying now, right? Because we went away from it. And these are like basic elements of musical, of music making is, giving a certain amount of something and then taking it away and then giving it back. And these are all things that like as an improviser can become very intuitive. But so the point I'm trying to make here is that may seem like an extremely strict frame, and in some ways it is. But I find that sometimes within the strictest frames are actually when you become the freest. Because you've painted yourself into a corner, and you literally don't know how you are going to be able to get out of this corner. You don't have any ready formulas to get out of it. And ready formulas are really the enemy of creativity. In free improvisation, we don't use a frame. There's no existing frame. And so you create the frame as you're going, or, a lot of free improvisation is extremely stream of consciousness, intuitive. If you've ever heard somebody go like, Anyway, if you've ever heard somebody kind of exploring those kinds of very atonal realms, that might be what you associate with the words free improvisation. Same way as in a conversation, if we're just kind of, we get a beer or something and we're talking, we might get into something that is of genuine interest to us. And so then we're gonna talk about that some more, right? So same even there, where I'm just going totally stream of consciousness, there are things that arise that I latch onto, as you're saying, then develop those, not even necessarily consciously, it's just a very natural thing to do. But then in Inventions, Reinventions, which takes as its motivation the Bach's inventions, which he wrote 300 years ago, I'm actually doing free improvisation that is nothing like that. It's very much within tonal harmony. But instead of using an existing frame, I invent the frame as I'm going. And that's been a really rich process for me, because it's like what I'm doing is in my mind, I'm imagining the possibilities within this quite disciplined world of tonal harmony that's been developed, for the last 500 years essentially. But really trying to be fresh with, I could go over there, I could go over there, I could go there, or I could modulate to this key, and then within that key I have these possibilities. If I'm doing that, I'm listening for a melody inside. I think that's always a really wonderful moment. And I do this a lot live. I've done this project a lot on stage. And so I'm sitting there, and I may have just finished, one of the Bach inventions, etc. This beautiful, on the surface, simple music, even though it's not simple at all, or it's not simplistic anyway. I may have just finished one of those, and so then I sit here and I just listen for a melody, because the real crux of this type of improvisation that I've decided to do for this project is storytelling. I need a protagonist. This is pretty much, there's really no story without a protagonist. And so Bach shows us in the inventions how to tell a story with a protagonist in music. So, for example, so this is our protagonist. And it's repeated right away. And then repeated in a different key. So we very quickly realize that that is our subject. This is what we call it in music, subject, which is, pretty close etymologically to like the hero of a story or the protagonist of a story. It's the subject, right? So we take in quite quickly that is the hero, the thing that we are going to follow on the journey, right? And soon enough, which is upside down, right? It's the inversion. So not only do we get to know our protagonist, but we also get to know our protagonist under different light, and different facets of the protagonist. And we meet our protagonist at home, in this case in C major. It feels safe, feels like this is where our protagonist lives. But then, as in most stories, and certainly stories that follow this concept of classical narrative structure, which is central to, ancient Greek plays, but also to like 99% of Hollywood movies, after we've gotten to know our character in a place of safety, an inciting event happens and our character is thrust into chaos, into the unknown, into some new situation that is unsafe for them, or at least unknown. And that's also what Bach does. He modulates to another key. And I'm really convinced that in music, just as well as in narration, we intuitively ask ourselves in that moment, what's going to happen? Is our protagonist going to be okay? Are they going to make it back home? Which is an extremely powerful device if you want to engage your audience, if you want them to care enough to give their attention to the story. It might be the only device that is really powerful in that way. So that's what Bach is showing us how to do in the inventions. And when I'm doing my free improvisations, which are free every time I perform this, that is also what I'm doing. So the first thing is, what's my protagonist going to be? So if I'm sitting here right now, the thing that just came up was, that's just what I just heard. I can't, I'm not going to judge it. But so maybe, I don't know, give me a key.
Let's get something warm, maybe D flat major.
Let's see, what was my melody? La da 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 da, right? And right? And so that would be the first thing that I'd be doing. And then maybe also choosing a time signature. What would you?
I don't know. Would that be weird to say something with a meter of 5 in some form?
5, it's amazing. We think of 5 in music as being this strange thing. But there's, the fact that we have 5 fingers is it's an extremely present number for us as humans. 5 fingers, 5 toes. Yeah. It's okay. So maybe I'll I improvised in 5/8 earlier in a kind of a fast 5/8 when I was playing over All Things You Are. But maybe I'll do a slow 5. And so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, Okay, so I'm just taking this protagonist on a journey. And when I'm performing this, I would say that maybe what I just did is really just a starting point, and stories can get really wild. But the point is that I have a kind of a direction to my story, and already in what I just improvised, I started in D flat major, and then I modulated to B flat minor, okay, the relative minor, which is something that Bach often does, although he would usually modulate to the 5 first, but really, that's just Bach. I can do it my own way. I'm not trying to sound like Bach, obviously, here. What I'm trying to do is engage with these abstract ideas of storytelling, but in my own voice, and which includes the fact that I'm, grew up in jazz. And then I modulated to the 5. I ended up in an A flat major. So this is just one other mode of improvisation. And yes, the purely intuitive mode exists too. And that's really fun too. But the thing is, even when you think you're being purely intuitive, really what's happening is that you're not being conscious of all the things that your intuition has learned over the years from your conscious mind.
Dan, would you say that there's been an evolution in your style of improvisation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's something that occurred in my 30s, which was at some point I really consciously let go of the need to be complicated or the need to be obtuse in any way, and really trying to embrace simplicity, because those are some of my favorite things in the greatest composers. Like Bach has this ability to write joyful music, not that it's ever simplistic, but in a simple way, in a way that's just broadly understandable, And that's one of the things actually that I think really came out in my latest solo record, Inventions Reinventions, is some of my free improvisations I think are really unapologetically, straightforwardly joyful. And that's just not something I think I would have allowed myself to do in my 20s, where I just had this abiding need to be more complex, less sincere, right? I think that's maybe the thing I've allowed myself to be more as I get older, is just more sincere.
And Dan, I wanted to conclude by asking about Lee Konitz.
Yeah, well, Lee was enormously influential on me, as well as really many generations of jazz musicians, because he first started recording in 1947. So I was very lucky to get to play with him for the last 12 years of his life. He died in the early
2020?
days. Yeah, in the early days of the pandemic, exactly. So I was just mentioning this idea of sincerity, and I think Lee, if I had to convey what he stood for in one word, I would say it was truth. And I think sincerity has a close kinship with the notion of truth, right? It's an emotional truth. It's a subjective truth, not necessarily an objective truth. These are two completely different kinds of truths. Objective truth would be dealt with in science, really, and subjective truth more in philosophy or poetry and art, and in religion as well. Anyway, I think Lee conveyed enormous subjective truth in the music he made. And the way that this expressed itself for him was in being extremely present in the moment. So just as an example, I played, somebody asked me after he died how many concerts I played with him, and I actually counted them, and it was over 150 all over the world. And there was probably not a single one of those concerts where we didn't play All the Things You Are. And he somehow managed to make All the Things You Are fresh every time. And I'm convinced that he didn't do it with any kind of effort. And that's, I think, aside from more conventional questions like the beauty of his tone on the saxophone and the beauty of his rhythm and his choice of melodies and all that, I think that's the thing that people are probably most drawn to him for, is that ability to find truth in the moment. And that's really the one thing that I've tried to carry on in my own music making. I just don't want to play stuff that I don't truly mean from the heart. And if that means the music might be a little simpler, that's not a bad thing. That's probably a good thing. And I miss Lee every day. I miss him as a source of truth in my life, as a source of tremendous wisdom, and also, sardonic humor. But I think this is the beauty of life in many ways, and I feel this also with my mom, who died in 2019. I think if a person has had an influence over other people, especially a positive influence, then they actually live on in those other people. So I feel my mom, but I also feel Lee in me, and I have to make a kind of a conscious effort, I think, regularly to honor those presences in me and remember the lessons they have, of which, both my mom and Lee had many. So, yeah, trying to stay true. That's the big lesson.
Dan, thank you so much for this. I was really moved, and I was fascinated by this truly direct examination of a creative process. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you for being.
Thank you so much, Schultes. It's really been a pleasure.